Thomas Nagel on Panpsychism in 1979. The recent embrace of panpsychism in certain analytic philosophy circles is said to have begun with, or more correctly, to have been inspired by, Thomas Nagel's Panpsychism chapter in his book Mortal Questions. It must be made clear that in this chapter, Nagel doesn't completely commit himself to panpsychism. Rather, he believed that panpsychism should be added to the current list of mutually incompatible and hopelessly unacceptable solutions to the mind-body problem. Here Nagel was simply saying that panpsychism is no better nor no worse than the other solutions to the mind-body problem. After Nagel's chapter, we need to jump to David Chalmers' 1996 book, The Conscious Mind. In that book, Chalmers speculates about, rather than fully embraces, panpsychism. And then we must jump again to Galen Strawson's 2006 article, Realistic Monism, Why Physicalism Entails Panpsychism. This paper, at least partly, inspired today's most popular panpsychist in the analytic tradition, Philip Goff. By panpsychism, I mean the view that the basic physical constituents of the universe have mental properties, whether or not they are parts of living organisms. Thomas Nagel. Nagel on emergence. One important argument, or at least it seems to solve various problems, from panpsychists is on emergence. In basic terms, panpsychists argue that panpsychism doesn't require a commitment to any kind of emergence. Thomas Nagel stated the problem with emergence in the following passage: "There are no truly emergent properties of complex systems. All properties of a complex system that are not relations between it and something else derive from the properties of its constituents and their effects on each other when so combined." That's a categorical and clear statement against emergence. So why do so many philosophers and lay people believe that there is such a thing? Nagel believed that this is an epistemological issue, not a metaphysical one. He continued, "Emergence is an epistemological condition. It means that an observed feature of the system cannot be derived from the properties currently attributed to its constituents. This is about a limit on our knowledge of the constituents of a system. In many ways, this isn't surprising, at least when it comes to complex systems. In basic terms, it means that scientists can't derive an observed feature of the system from any single property of that system, or even from the entire set of properties of that system." Nagel then hinted at panpsychism as a solution, but this is a reason to conclude that either the system has further constituents of which we are not yet aware, or the constituents of which we are aware have further properties that we have not yet discovered. Of course, it's possible that any given system does have further constituents of which we are not yet aware. However, it's the second possibility which interested Nagel, those constituents of which we are aware and which have further properties that we have not yet discovered. One wonders about the word discovered here, in that even panpsychists admit that the mental properties of constituents won't be discovered in any scientific or empirical sense. Instead, they're metaphysically postulated as a good explanation of the observed features of a system. Nagel then technically laid out the precise situation we now find ourselves in. He wrote, "If the mental properties of an organism are not implied by any physical properties, but must derive from properties of the organism's constituents, then those constituents must have non-physical properties from which the appearance of mental properties follows when the combination is of the right kind." Here Nagel was staying clear of saying that such constituents actually have mental properties. Instead, he was saying that they are non-physical. These non-physical properties do bring about mental properties when the combination is of the right kind. Again, it's a strong enough claim that there are non-physical properties. However, Nagel wasn't saying that they are, at this stage at least, mental properties. Instead, they become mental properties when the combination is of the right kind. Nagel makes all this clear in the following passage. There would be properties of matter that were not physical from which the mental properties of organic systems were derived. This could still be called panpsychism. Again, non-physical not equal mental. Instead, mental properties can be derived from non-physical properties. Despite all that, Nagel believed that his own position could still be called panpsychism. It was here that Nagel stressed his proto-panpsychist view, which works against what he earlier called panpsychism in the more familiar sense. He wrote, "Presumably the components out of which a point of view is constructed would not themselves have to have points of view. How could a single self be composed of many selves?" Those words tackle what later came to be called the combination problem. It was coined by William Seeger in his 1995 book Consciousness, Information and Panpsychism. They also hint at an emergence when there isn't supposed to be any emergence in the panpsychist position. After all, a point of view can be said to emerge from non-physical components, which themselves don't have points of view. That seems like some kind of emergence. Take an example from Philip Goff. He discusses little subjects actually seeing all the colours of the spectrum individually. Then, when these little conscious subjects are taken together as a single big conscious subject, Goff postulates that they may bring about a visual experience as of seeing white. In other words, we have little conscious subjects experiencing the various colours of the spectrum separately summing together to produce a big conscious subject which experiences the colour white. This big conscious subject's experience of white is therefore over and above the many and varied experiences of all the little conscious subjects which constitute, or, to use Goff's term, compose it. This is complicated even more when we move forward in time 34 years and quickly consider another similar Philip Goff argument, this time about minds. He argued that there may be little minds, or seats of experience in the brain, and all of them, on their own, are very simple. Yet now, of course, we have the problem of the composition, or combination, of all these little minds in order to make a big mind. Nagel spotted an odd consequence of this distinction between components with no points of view and a whole being with a point of view. He said that the components would have to be recombinable to form different points of view, for not only can a single organism have different experiences, but its matter can be recombined to form other organisms with totally different forms of experience. This hints at a more religious and monist position in which, bizarrely, the matter of a dead animal can be reconstituted to form another being which has different forms of experience. This can go on indefinitely. It also shows that emergence hasn't been erased from the panpsychist picture. Nagel on familiar panpsychism. So which kind of panpsychism did Nagel have a problem with? Let him explain. Panpsychism, in this his sense, does not entail panpsychism in the more familiar sense, according to which trees and flowers, and perhaps even rocks, lakes and blood cells, have consciousness of a kind. To be rhetorical for a moment, it can be said that the kind of panpsychism that claims that trees, flowers, rocks, etc. are conscious gives panpsychism a bad name. Many people simply can't make any sense of it. Nagel's position works against certain kinds of panpsychism, such as Rudy Rucker's and Philip Goff's. In his short essay, Mind is a Universally Distributed Quality, which can be found in the book What is Your Dangerous Idea?, Rudy Rucker says that each object has a mind. That is, stars, hills, chairs, rocks, scraps of paper, flakes of skin, molecules, all have minds. Now take this passage from Philip Goff. We now know that plants communicate, learn and remember. I can see no reason other than anthropic prejudice not to ascribe to them a conscious life of their own. However, Nagel's proto-panpsychism is a lot easier to digest. That said, Nagel immediately qualified himself when he wrote the following words. But we know so little about how consciousness arises from matter in our own case and that of animals in which we can identify it, that it would be dogmatic to assume that it does not exist in other complex systems, or even in systems the size of a galaxy, as the result of the same basic properties of matter that are responsible for us. It's not clear why Nagel stopped at the possibility of galaxies instantiating consciousness. Surely the next level up would be the entire universe, or at least a cluster of galaxies. In any case, this is the bullet that people will need to bite if they accept panpsychism. In other words, if what is important in this metaphysical picture are the basic non-physical constituents which give rise to consciousness, then those constituents exist everywhere. So why should they only give rise to consciousness in human beings and other animals? After all, a galaxy is almost as complex as a human being's brain and body. That said, in the panpsychist picture, complexity doesn't always matter, or matter at all. If we have proto-mental constituents from the very beginning, then perhaps only a minimal level of mentality is needed. David Chalmers, for example, plays up simplicity. He writes that one wonders how relevant this whiff of complexity will ultimately be to the arguments about consciousness. Chalmers goes further when he says that a model with 5 units, say, is to be regarded as a model of consciousness. Surely a model with 1 unit will also yield some insight. At a prima facie level, it does indeed seem obvious that complexity matters. After all, many theorists have made a strong link between the complexity of the human brain and consciousness. Chalmers himself acknowledges the intuitive appeal of complexity. Yet he also writes, after all, does it not seem that this rich superposition of information is an inessential element of consciousness? So Chalmers rejects this requirement for complexity. An old-style or familiar panpsychist would say that no level of complexity is really needed, at least not for a minimal level of consciousness. Nagel's panpsychist universalism. Nagel then stated his universalist conclusion about the aforementioned non-physical properties. He told his readers that, since any matter can compose an organism, all matter must have these properties. That statement seems obviously false. It isn't the case that any matter can compose an organism. It needs to be matter of a certain type. Nagel himself said that the mental properties of all matter, therefore, would have to be not species-specific but universal, since they would underlie all possible forms of consciousness. Thus, in this panpsychist picture, these mental properties would be roughly equivalent to electrons and quarks in physics. They'd underpin literally all instantiations of consciousness on a universal scale. It must be noted, however, that Nagel moved, in the quote above, from talking about non-physical properties to talk of the mental properties of all matter. This seems to go against his earlier arguments. Nagel's criticisms of panpsychism. Nagel offered these words of warning. There is no reason to think that all possibilities have been thought of, so there is no reason to assume that a view is correct if all currently conceivable alternatives are even more unacceptable. Thus, panpsychism isn't correct simply because all currently conceivable alternatives are even more unacceptable, i.e., the argument of elimination. Yet it can be seen that many panpsychists assume precisely this. In other words, panpsychism is often treated as a neat and tidy solution. It's also seemingly new and very different to all the alternatives. Due to these very reasons, it has become popular in recent years. So Nagel did tackle the problems with panpsychism. For example, he stated an intuitive one. It is difficult to imagine how a chain of explanatory inference could ever get from the mental states of whole animals back to the proto-mental properties of dead matter. Wouldn't that chain of explanatory inference work in the opposite direction, from dead matter to mental states? However, this difference may not make a difference. After all, Nagel is talking about explanatory inference, not any kind of physical or scientific reduction. In any case, this explanatory inference would need to be both speculative and metaphysical in nature. Thus, it's no wonder that Nagel acknowledged that this is a kind of breakdown we cannot envision, perhaps it is unintelligible.